Today we are going to go to the past, specifically 1993, and this pattern from McCalls, which is 6569. I got this pattern from a local charity shop, along with these two others. These we'll cover in some future videos, but just a quick peek for now. It's very rare to find men's sewing patterns full stop. Unless you go specifically online and look for them, they're just not that commonplace. To find three in a charity shop is unusual. To find that all three are in my size is pretty much unheard of. In fact, in my experience, it is unheard of. I've been wanting to make some 90s shirts. If ever you've watched any amount of 90s sci-fi, you will have seen this silhouette and perhaps not even realised it. Very full in the body, very full in the sleeves, and quite often, as with this one, it's influenced by sort of American Western designs. So these are very sort of cowboy shirty, if you ignore the fabrics that have been used here. This pattern's great. It's modular, so all these different designs on here are all included in the pack, and it allows you to chop and change the elements that you like, which is what I'm going to be doing today. Here you can see the basic shirt types. So we have a grandad shirt. That's the ones where they just have a stand for the collar but no turn down bit, and a patch pocket, and it only buttons for the top half. You have a more standard sort of button down dress shirt here, which goes all the way down the front with the buttons and patch pockets. The cowboy shirt here, I'm doing a variation on this one. This one buttons all the way down the front, but I won't be doing that. And then this, I have seen them called Union shirts before. I assume that's something to do with American Civil War. It has a placket that goes over the front to hide the buttons. What I'm going to work on today is this shirt as a basis, but with this body and no pockets and that collar. This should give you a good idea of how a pattern like this gives you more options than just the 6 on the front, because the basic body and sleeves, with the exception of this one, are all the same, and then elements like the collars, pockets, I think the cuffs are all the same on them, and decorative details like the placket here and the yoke on here are all interchangeable. So you get a lot of choice, and I will get a lot of use out of this one pattern. I've got all the pattern pieces cut out here and just draped on the mannequin. Everything's been pressed. Gives you a quick idea of what this is going to look like. This fabric is I hadn't planned to use this. I made an order for a more complicated project that's coming later this year, and they threw in this printed fabric. The weird thing is I know this fabric quite well because my gran used to have some curtains made of it back in the 90s, so in a way it couldn't be more perfect for what I want to make. I wanted to do something floral and something, you know, spring or autumny, which this kind of has a flavour of. The rest of the cotton for the shirt is lining material from another pair of curtains that I already had. Always salvage the lining material of curtains. It's usually cotton, and it's usually a brilliant thing for using for either shirts or just for generic mock-ups. Around the back, you can see the yoke here, and the reason I'm not using this printed fabric for the whole shirt is I only had so much. So I can do the yokes, the sleeves, the collar for the outer, didn't have quite enough for the inner, and then everything else will be done in the plain cotton. It's a fairly simple pattern, this one, if you make a few changes. I know I'm deviating from the pattern, but everything I do here uses the standard pattern pieces that are available in that pattern if you have it, so this will just speed things up for you a little bit. Normally, the yoke sections on the front and the back are loose, and they have a button that goes through the point to hold it onto the shirt. I really hate that. So I'm not doing it. Instead, I'll turn over this edge here, I'll show you later, and we'll top stitch that down onto the panels so this and this all become one panel. The other thing I'm doing is I'm keeping the short placket on the front so it stops around about here. That's just something I prefer with shirts, but if you prefer it to button all the way to the bottom, just use that base for the front panel and that's fine. That's one of the great things about the modularity with this design, is you can just change it. If, for example, you don't like these yokes, simply don't add them, and then you don't need them. I'm not adding any pockets. I hate pockets on shirts. They're useless. Yes, and at the back as well, there's normally a button in the middle there. I can imagine that being incredibly annoying whenever you sit down, because that would press on your back. So as with the front, we'll just top stitch this section down and make that into all one panel. For the collar and the cuffs, I'm using calico. This is a very stiff cotton and it comes in various different weights and usually different colours. I'm using an unbleached one and I prefer this to iron-on interfacing. If you want to use iron-on interfacing or any other sort of stiffener, then go for it. I just prefer to use calico. To put the back yoke on, first thing you want to do is fold your pattern in half and mark your centre point wherever that happens to be. Providing you've cut everything out, you shouldn't really have any line-up issues, but just in case, it's good practice just to find out where your centre line really is. For the yoke itself, we're not sewing along any of this edge, we're only sewing this bottom edge. So treat these two layers as if they're one layer of fabric. The first thing to do is roll under your edge and then either pin or baste it, whichever your preference is. You can press this. If it's a very springy fabric, that can help. I'm not going to here because it won't really be needed. Once I've done this edge with the pins and I've made sure it's central, I then put some extra pins in here just to hold the two layers together, and that will make sewing this down easier. We'll then top stitch along this edge all the way across, and that will be that. I haven't decided just at the moment whether I'm going to go with a white or a green or a brown for the top stitching on the decorative elements. I'm not sure that a contrast stitch is really going to be the thing. I think this fabric is busy enough that just a plain white is probably going to be best. You want to do the same thing as this for the front panels as well. It's exactly the same way of laying out. The only difference is you don't need to find your centre line. Just make sure as you do it that the 2 points at the bottom here are level across the front, so you don't end up with like a wonky front to the shirt. The shirt is very full, so it shouldn't matter too much, but just a little bit of preparation gives you that slightly nicer finish when you're done. Did my usual trick here of putting these pins in the wrong way around for the sewing machine. Every time, it's like USB sticks, always the wrong way around. I'm using a zipper foot here and I'm keeping very close to the edge with that because I want a very fine line. I actually ended up going with a bottle green. None of my whites or off-whites matched the fabric very well and they jumped out in a way that wasn't nice, so I used some bottle green thread and that seems to look a lot better. Take your time when you do this. Accuracy is more important than speed. As you come to the point here, you're going to have to turn the fabric. So go as far as you're comfortable on the foot. And then as you're getting near, turn the machine by hand for those last few stitches until you get to the point that looks about right for turning. Leave the needle down when you lift the foot, and that will hold everything in place. Make sure as you turn it that your various layers are nice and flat in relation to one another, nothing snagged up underneath, that sort of thing. If you're a little bit concerned about this underneath layer pulling through, you can always pin and baste more of that. Put the foot back down and then very slowly do the rest of the seam. No need to double back at the end of the seam here because this edge will be caught when we sew the rest of the shirt together. Don't forget to take your secondary pins out if you've used them. And that is then ready to go for a press, which will crisp all of this edge up here. Possibly the most confusing part of this pattern is the placket. This is the little bit that goes on the front where your buttons and buttonholes are. If you do the full length body one, they tend to be easier. We're doing the short one, which is this version on the instructions here. The first thing that you need to do is take your placket piece, which is in the outer material, and your interfacing piece. And when you look at the pattern, there's various lines on here. This one with the arrows is the grain line, so that shows you the direction of the fabric itself. Now, fabric is usually warp and weft, and whichever one of those you decide is going to be your up and down, that's your grain line. The pattern piece itself has seam allowances included, and this whole piece of paper here is what you do in your outer fabric. The dotted line is what you do in the interfacing. However, when you read instructions, you find that there's ways that you do it yourself that might not be exactly as the pattern intended. So that's what this is for me. I find what works with these is to cut off this edge where the dotted line is of the interfacing material. You can then fold over the outer edge material onto your interfacing, which is what it suggests to do on the instructions down here, and then you top stitch this edge down according to the instructions. So that's what we shall do. Once you've done that, you repeat it on the other side, and I've just realised a mistake I've made here, which is that this folded edge should be on that side, because these go next to one another with the folded edges on the outside edge. All I need to do for that is just turn everything over and correct it. One mistake corrected. So these two placket pieces have to be mirrored. When you look at the pattern piece itself, that's not very obvious. There's two little triangles printed here which are notches for alignment. I find these very hit and miss on this particular pattern, and I don't find them very useful on this particular piece. Anyway, we've now got our two placket pieces here, and according to the instructions we'll be sewing that to the front of the shirt. So imagine this is the front of the shirt, and then that slit we cut down the front will line up here. I'm going to top stitch these, sew this onto the front of the shirt, and then show you the next. It's sort of complicated and sort of not stage of putting this together. With the two placket pieces now sewn to the front, you can see there's quite a large seam allowance here, and this is as the pattern has it. There is one change I would probably make here. The reason why that's such a large seam allowance is you have to cut this slot at the bottom for when you turn everything through, and that dictates how big that allowance is. I think if, or rather when, I do another one of these, I won't cut that piece until after I've sewn these on. As we saw before, I'd folded this edge and top stitched it. Our next job is we need to graduate these seams here. So that means cutting each layer back to the stitch line. And you start with the interfacing and you cut that fairly close to your seam line here. The next one, which is your top fabric for the placket, you cut a little bit further that way, so it's a slightly larger allowance, and then your last layer has the largest allowance of them all. This then allows, when you fold this round, everything to fold without being bulky, and also cuts down on the amount of fabric in this seam. I'll trim this off camera and then I will bring you back and show you what that actually looks like so that it makes a little bit more sense. This shows it a bit more clearly. I've got the panel a bit wonky on the mannequin here, so just pretend that's level. As I described, your first one, you go fairly close to the seam. I did find this side easier to trim than this side, probably because of which way handed I am. Your second layer sticks out a bit more, and you barely take anything at all off this final layer. Do that for both sides. Of course, you've got the split at the bottom, and it is important these are a little bit longer than this section here, because we'll be folding that up in a moment. Next job is to fold these around to catch all the raw edges and sew them down, and then we'll do the bottom section there. As it says on our pattern, at the moment we've done this stage, we've done the graduated trimming bit, and now we're going to fold the edges over and press and fold and sew, and then we should be all done, all pressed. The calico really helps get a nice crisp edge on things, and this cotton presses really nicely anyway. They're a great combination for this sort of thing. First thing you do is press this edge before you fold anything. So when that's laid out flat, just make sure where you've sewn this on here is nice and smooth, and press your outer edge first so it goes nice and flat, bit of steam, and then you fold the whole piece in half until not the seam but the folded edge here meets with the seam that's in here. So it should just cover it like that. Now I'm going to run 2 lines of top stitching. One will go on this edge, so you'll have like a tram line here, and one will go on this edge. The one on this side is structural, this side's just decorative to balance it out. You can whip stitch this by hand if you would prefer to have no top stitching, but I'm going to embrace the top stitching on this. There's going to be a lot of visible stitching on it with the way we build it, and I think that will look smart. I think it will tie in with the rest of the design. Once I've done that, we'll cover what you do with the bottom here. Also, because this is a gents shirt, it will be left over right. Have I got that right? I've just noticed another minor mistake there. When you do your plackets, when you come to the finish, you want to make sure they overlap the way you prefer. And for me, that is left over right. So this is the left on the shirt, this is the right. So this is the top one that goes over. If you prefer to do it the other way, do it the other way. You can make that decision at this point, but once you put the bottom on here, whichever way round you put that is set in stone. And kind of difficult to undo afterwards if you change your mind. With everything all top stitched, the next challenge is tidying up the bottom edge of this. And on the pattern, it seems to suggest that this little triangular bit here just goes on the inside raw, and I don't really like that. So what I've done instead is I've turned up the bottom of the placket for the outside and the inside. The inside one is just on the reverse, so it's inside the shirt. And then we have this piece. Then I've turned the outside one up, which lines up with the inside placket. This is very difficult to actually show and explain. It's easier to do in person. And what I shall then do is I shall sew along this line, catching inside and outside placket together, sandwiching the shirt material here between them. We'll then trim off the excess of this triangle, and I will sew another line further up here, and that will catch all of the raw edges inside here. It's a high stress point of the shirt anyway, and it will give it a little bit more strength. My light is going at the moment, so I'm going to make this the last job of today, and then we will have to come back to this when I shall start sewing together slightly less complicated sections than this is. It's not pressed yet, and it's not perfect. I do have trouble sometimes getting these right. There's a lot going on, there's a lot of materials and layers and things. It can be very difficult to get them right. So I do have a little bit of a pucker there, and my stitching isn't exactly straight. But honestly, it doesn't matter. That's never going to bother me. And if I really wanted to, I could get some embroidery or something and cover it up. We shan't worry about that. We're not chasing perfection. What I am happy about is the visible top stitching, apart from where it's wandered off slightly there, which I don't understand, is perfectly fine. The placket works as it should. So this is all ready now for buttons and buttonholes, so I'll have to find some buttons that I like for this. And when we come back to this, it should get a lot easier.